I am so thrilled because I want to introduce everyone to you as this is the brilliant younger sister I always imagined I would have. When I read her books, it is like I feel like we connect across time with so many of the same passions to do. It is just extraordinary, from Pushkin to Emily Dickinson and so many other things.
I know, it's wild, and such an honor to have you say that, because you, in my mind, have always been this brilliant older sister, and didn't know that we'd have a chance to have this kind of an exchange. So this is just a thrill, really an honor.
It is one of the great joys. And as I say, we've been talking about joy is radical. And
Yes.
it is joyful to be here with you.
Yes. I mean, how rare to be able to walk into a conversation. We came into this space and radical joy was the first thing we talked about before we were even sipping our tea, coffee. So there's a kismet, about our energy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the ones is this is the patchwork quilt. When I was seeing your most recent 2 books, I love the combination for me of words and images, but also biography and autobiography. And all together, you create this thing on the patchwork quilt that feels connected to what our great grandmothers are creating, their aesthetics. That you're very much a daughter of the Academy, Oxford, Harvard, all these places. But we also, I feel the roots in that, your grandparents' kitchen. And I always say that I learned more about aesthetics from my grandmother's patchworking and her garden than I did at Harvard, and I learned a lot at Harvard. And but I love this quilting to truth.
I was thinking about your metaphor of quilting and describing your forthcoming album, or maybe I shouldn't say it that way for the camera, but for your most recent album. And this image of you sleeping under your grandmother's patchwork quilt made from her party dresses, and then describing your songs as each their own party, right? Resonated because I do think of how we create as quilting, as also a way to retain a kind of knowing that's given to us from our ancestors. That's as powerful as knowledge, right? That we get in the academy, so called. So quilting is definitely the heart of how I wrote The Rise, The Unseen Truth, and continue to think about practice. So we have that in common too, and it's rare to see because a lot of people choose a route, and you, I mean, as a writer and as novelist, writer, and songwriter, and food activist, you quilt really the world, right?
Because our great artifact is our own lives, right? And I think when I thought about the grandmother, one of the things that her quilt, the pallet that I used to sleep on, was made from her old party dresses. And she really emphasized that part. But when I looked as a grown woman in my 60s, thinking about that, what it would be like, whether she's making those dresses in Selma, Alabama in the 20s or buying them in a store, it would have been very difficult, very painful. Lots of negative things would have happened buying that material, being asked to be at the back of the line, the difficulties of getting the money for it. But she chose to share with me the part of the story of what it wasn't perfect, but what she masterfully created. And these are these moments of her own community joy.
Absolutely.
And I love that she laid me down on her triumph, which did not mean that I couldn't come to see what she had to overcome to get to that patchwork quilt for me.
You make me just want to tear up here. Laid me down on her triumph. God. I haven't shared this before, but you're making me think of what animates so much of the creative work I do and hope to continue to do. My grandfather, when he was laid down, when he died, he gave me his unused drawing paper and paints and pastels. And I, as a young girl, didn't really understand the power of that unfinished blank page because it was faded, and I thought, well, but quickly realized, my God, he is giving me the tools of what for him were his triumph. He was expelled from high school in New York City in 1926. So around the same time, right? Your grandmother would have been quilting, creating, because he wanted to know where we were in the textbooks. He didn't accept the answer that the teacher gave him that Black Americans had done nothing to merit inclusion. He wanted to know what the whole world was. And he refused to stop asking that question. And he was expelled for his so-called impertinence. But he became an artist and he became a jazz musician. He played backup with Count Basie. And I just learned not only Duke Ellington, but Billie Holiday. He went on tour with her. I didn't even. And that for him was the triumph, the ability to create for himself what he knew he should have been able to find in those textbooks through those paints, through those images that I grew up seeing, but didn't see as political acts. I saw as creative acts. I then understood work through that gift when he died. Was him saying to me, you can continue.
He was giving you space.
He was giving me space.
And imagining that you would have more space than he had as he had navigated worlds.
That's right.
It's really my father never went to school until he went to high school.
Really?
Because that grandmother my father was born in 1929. So when your grandfather was navigating this war on education, that she would not let her children go to school in Alabama because she said that they beat the Black kids so bad. And so they were able to resist sending them to school. So my father never got, and my grandparents, neither of them could read or write. My grandmother learned a little. But it was funny that when my father arrived in Detroit and went to Miller High School in Black Bottom, he fell in love with Shakespeare immediately. And that seemed so odd from someone that never had a pair of shoes at 13.
Yeah.
And I said, why? He said, it sounded a lot like the King James Bible to me. And so what he had learned to read and write in the churches. And he had learned hearing different preachers preach the same text differently. That's how he learned to integrate text and interrogate text.
Yes.
And I loved it. So I remind my daughter, as a third generation Shakespeare scholar, that my father was the first one. And he ended up learning whole Shakespeare plays by heart. My father never finished, but I think one semester at college, he went down to Atlanta and was at Morris Brown. But he said he could not be back in segregation. He could not be back in Jim Crow. He said, I've been trying. And he went back into business with his father up in Detroit. But he continued this voracious life of reading and introduced me to Pushkin and, and Shakespeare that he loved and knew so well from, and the Black newspapers, the Michigan Chronicle. And so I had a very unusual reading life from childhood, mainly newspapers, Shakespeare, and some translated Pushkin.
That helps understand. Yes. I think I did too, because my mother's, I'm speaking about my mother's father and my grandfather, and she was the one who would bring into the home, I think the texts that he had socialized her to understand were really critical because he knew what was being left out, right? So we both have had that experience, right, of seeing and in our house knowing what was being silenced.
Absolutely. And some of it being the people. My father rarely got angry at me, but I remember in kindergarten, I came home and said it was Thanksgiving, so I had only been in school a few months. And suddenly, I did not know the alphabet. I was one of the only kids in my kindergarten class that didn't know the alphabet, the ABCs, because I could already read. And so when they're saying the letters came in some order, I said, no, cat comes first, and this one, and then another one, zoo, the Z. Like, what is this? The Z comes first. But when I came home and told my father that Columbus had discovered America, you would have thought that I said I did not love my grandmother. He was so angry at me for saying why was I calling this a discovery?
Yes.
That when did I know that he used the word Indian at that point, that Indians were there, that discovered for who? And he really was very passionate in his desire for me to critique what was being told to me by authorities, and that it was a complete failure that I had.
My grandfather placed that same impulse in me. I know when I went to college, we both went to Harvard. I was studying I was studying art history, or trying to, and then learning in these sweeping overview classes about so-called masters in the canon. And I wondered, why they were leaving out Kerouac, or why at the time. And that sense of having validated, in my young life through my grandfather, the fact that what I saw was missing mattered, right? Paved the way for the work to come. And my initials, SEL, are meant to honor him. Shout out Emmanuel Lee, So.
Well, it's funny. One of the things, and one of the reasons I have to use actually the word adore I adore your work, is because you connect the oral histories and the passions and the observations and intuitions to the most extraordinary scholarly rigor that you embody and embrace, but it's not the only thing you have. And it coexists. And one of the things that I've been slow to close this gap, but what I love about My Black Country for me, and this is a twilight for me. I'm 60, I'm about to be 66, but I'm also like 6 or 7 years out of aggressive breast cancer. Yeah. That's the one that's really common with a lot of Black women. So I have a sense of being in a happy evening of life that feels very satisfying. And one of the reasons it feels so satisfying is when I was a little girl in Detroit, one of the things I knew from my Detroit world, you talk about Count Basie, was that Will Hardin played on that big hillbilly hit, or what my father probably called Peckerwood hit back then. And I remember working on the Kim Burns documentary, and Bill C. Malone, who's considered the classic scholar of country music out of the University of Texas, he just resisted this information that I had. I mean, Will Hardin was alive when I was a child. My father had knew Will Hardin. Yeah. And Louis Armstrong is moving through this world. These people literally knew they had played on this #1 million selling record in 1930. Yeah. So you don't have to believe they were liars, but how do you document it? And it's so interesting that one scholar found the sheet music in I think an archive in New Orleans, with Jimmy Rogers in his own hand, it said, and Louis' wife Lil played piano. And I found, using YouTube, the old Johnny Cash show that I remembered vaguely, but then Doc found, in which Johnny Cash interviews Louis Armstrong, and they even recalled the specific date of the recording in Los Angeles. And so what's interesting is that finally Bill C. Malone had to admit, I was right. But it was so late that in the Kim Burns documentary, they only would include Louis Armstrong because they said in the time they had to tell the story, nobody would believe it. That there's But I said, well, does it make it more likely or less likely that we do not include it the next time we want to tell it?